Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome everyone to this online session. We're talking about energy storage, market opportunities, and the potential in Africa. These are two very important topics for different reasons. Obviously, energy storage is absolutely basic and essential if we are to have a 100% renewable grid. And I think in many, many ways, most of the global markets are heading in this direction. So when you start to put a lot of variable renewable energy in the grid, it comes to a point where it gets harder and harder to manage, and you have to be thinking much more about the systematic approach and how does the whole grid system work together to deliver firm, reliable power. And this is where battery storage and energy storage comes into this picture. And in the case of Africa, is one of the largest potential markets in terms of everything that it still has to deliver. So there's two really interesting opportunities coming at a very interesting time as well, with the COVID crisis and the economic recovery that will have to follow in the next few years. So we're looking at this topic today and the potential today, and we have with us two experts that are going to go deep into this topic, and I'd like to get them to introduce themselves so that you can get to know them a little bit. So Tom, if you could please unmute your microphone and introduce yourself, your company, well, your institution actually, and where you're joining from today.
Thank you, Belen, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody all over the world. My name's Tom Adcock, and I work with the PPP Transaction Advisory Team at IFC. I'm actually based here in Johannesburg, in South Africa. IFC primarily is involved in debt financing and equity financing projects, and also other commercial opportunities in this sector. But personally, I'm actually working on a number of utility scale solar transactions here in Africa, and actually now more recently some solar plus storage work for as clients on the continent as well. So that's me. Back over to you, Belen.
Thank you very much, Tom. And now we have also Luke. Luke, I'd like you to also introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. As Thomas said, just hi, everybody. My name is Luke Whitmer. I work with Wärtsilä. Wärtsilä is known for mostly our large engine plants historically, Finnish-based company, a lot of power generation across the African continent. My role is in the energy storage and optimization team, where we are integrating energy storage with renewables in standalone applications as well as in hybridized applications. So that's really what the core of our business is as a technology provider, designing, building power plants. And then I'm located in the US, in Virginia, near Washington, DC.
So from what I can tell, we're all still at home, right? We are over here, you guys are over there, and also South Africa. So probably many of the people, I don't know if you've noticed, guys, but there are people here from all over the world. We have people, from many, many places in Africa, of course, and in Europe, a few Asians, India. And then we have people in California. That must be like 5 a.m. there. So obviously there is, a lot of interest to be here live as well. We have many more people that have also registered. So what I'd like to ask now is, actually, Araceli, if you can prepare Tom's screen. And I will take this opportunity to just explain a little bit how today is going to go in case you are new to our webinars. So we will have two presentations. First, we'll have Tom, and then we'll have Luke. And then after those presentations, we'll take questions. And the questions, we will take them if you send them in the Q&A at the bottom. It's important that you send them there, because if you send them in the chat, they kind of get lost, in all of the chatters. So like that, we can control them really, really well. So at the bottom, just two little bubbles, just send the questions there, and we'll try and answer as many as we can. Just wanted to remind you all that we are recording the session and that the materials are going to be available, so you don't have to worry, about any of that. And without further ado, actually, I just like Tom, I yield to you.
Thank you. Hello again, everyone. So my presentation, I'm going to just be giving essentially an overview of the storage activities that we see here on the continent, and also just a little bit about the challenges and the opportunities that we're seeing in the sector. I'll speak a little bit from the investment perspective, but also be speaking from the transaction advisory side, given that's my sort of bread and butter work, and just how IFC sees itself assisting in creating these some new markets here in Africa. Next slide, please. So look, this is just an introductory slide to just really show what we see as the potential for battery storage growth for the market. This is globally. You know, it shows just over the next decade or so just how energy storage is really going to enter this sustained period of you know, really quite significant and rapid growth. Just from the trends that we're seeing here, you know, this obviously impacts us in the sub-Saharan African market, and it's potentially a very large market developing. Next slide, please. So just, I know this will be very obvious to some participants on the call, because we've just got such a broad audience. I thought it would be useful just to give an overview of the various usage cases for solar, the number of sort of in front of and behind the meter usage cases, which most of which these are relevant in the African context. So we see, you know, investment opportunities in a whole number of applications, but just to go through a few of these. So for standalone storage, I mean, frequency modulation, we already see some interesting movement in this space in the African context. Definitely for transmission and distribution, CapEx deferral, you know, deferring the required investment from governments. So the upgrades from utilities on their grids is obviously very appealing again in the African market. The third point, which is really, I guess, the main topic of today's talk, is the in front of the meter batteries supplementing renewables. So essentially this is managing intermittent solar PV and wind on grids. And you know, we essentially can split this into sort of three main buckets. So the sort of the shorter term storage for up to 30 minutes for things like ramp rate control, then you know, up to 2 hours for renewables firming, and then up to 4 hours and even more for peak shifting applications. In terms of spot market arbitrage, I think this is less relevant in the context of the continent here for the time being, just given how the markets operate. And then on this slide, there's a number of behind the meter applications, but I think, you know, I won't go into too much detail just for the purposes of this workshop, but I mean, C&I and residential solutions are clearly obviously very relevant as well in the African context. Next slide, please. So just a little bit on IFC's strategy. So, you know, renewables is very much at the heart of what we're doing at IFC in terms of our power strategy. You know, we're acutely aware that to deploy more renewables at scale here requires, and going through these boxes at the bottom, you know, transmission and distribution, smart grids, it potentially requires some gas, and obviously also energy storage. You know, storage clearly has this very important role to play for emerging market grids of the future, and particularly, you know, a number of the utility scale applications that I mentioned on the previous slides, you know, are particularly useful for the integration of renewables and CapEx deferral. At present, there's definitely a global drive to fund these projects from both DFIs and private sector. You know, it's still evolving sector on the continent here. So, you know, bankable opportunities are still quite rare in emerging markets. And I think we're also being quite cautious that, you know, there is some suggestion, given the economics of these projects, of initially in the early stages, some crowding out of private sector investors from grant-funded projects. So, this will change, but potentially we'll see some publicly funded battery projects, perhaps initially more for an EPC market, with the IPP market evolving a little bit more slowly. Next slide, please. So this is a slide that just highlights some of the activities that we see happening here on the continent. Just to highlight a few, so in Nigeria, there's a tender to augment solar for universities, and ESCOM here in South Africa is preparing some tenders to provide grid support. So again, this transmission distribution deferral. A couple of our own projects, so scaling solar plus storage tender is ongoing in Madagascar. So that's something that's being run actually by our department. Then we also have Zanzibar. This is a very early stage. It's a pre-feasibility piece of work. So there's no tender planned at present, but we see that potentially there could be some battery storage needed there on the island and indeed other island grids at some point in the future. And then lastly, worth mentioning, I think, I won't go through all of these, but Senegal's frequency response tender, I think this is, potentially first of a kind on the continent, and again, very interesting. So, just like in South Africa, this would be deferring T&D upgrades. So next slide, please. So now I'm going to talk about some of the drivers of the challenges and opportunities we see globally, but also obviously relevant to the African context. Just next slide, please. So just for the drivers, for market drivers, the costs of batteries are falling significantly. The demand is certainly increasing for batteries, is increasing alongside the need for renewables. There's a number of contexts on the continent where the energy prices are such that batteries, either solar plus batteries or even in other contexts, they're becoming competitive quite quickly. The next point, grid stability. I mean, this is a major issue with frequency regulation. So, this is a key consideration, even in countries where there is quite a low renewables penetration. And then on the challenges side, I mean, so regulation is obviously still a key challenge. I'll talk a bit more about this in the next slide. Clearly something to be addressed in all the markets that IFC works in. Sorry, actually, go back. So I'm not quite ready to come to that slide yet. So could you just flick back? Thank you. So the next point on challenges is the operations and maintenance challenges. This is especially pertinent in emerging market context. Lithium-ion prices, potentially will reach their limit at some point. So something else that we want to bear in mind. And then just the fact that the revenue streams in these projects, we see them being layered into, for these projects to make commercial sense in developed markets like the US. So, it's definitely going to add additional complexity to the policy and the regulation challenges in the African context. And then the final point on this slide, just globally, I think there's still a lot of projects not being banked, so perhaps are better suited to being equity or mezzanine funded. So again, this point of, at the moment, the pool of projects for senior debt financing is somewhat limited. Okay, so next slide, please. So just other policy technology issues. So I mean, from the policy perspective, you know, the lack of regulations is very much a priority for the World Bank. You know, just to ensure that these projects can be implemented. From the IFC side as well, from transaction advisory, you know, we want to see projects implemented and financeable. At the moment, there's a lack of business models that are standardized, and this isn't the global situation as well, with no sort of specific one trend or model emerging. So, you know, for instance, you see both energy and capacity payment PPAs being adopted across the world. So IFC definitely has this role, I think, in the African context to work with governments to standardize these procurement processes for our clients. And, you know, this is very much my bread and butter work for products like scaling solar. So we asked the question, why also not standardize some applications for storage tenders? I mean, and we're not just an investor, as I mentioned at the beginning, you know, so in our capacity as transaction advisors, we are here certainly to act as honest broker in these transactions. So really to make sure that the risk allocation can be fair, both on the government client side, but also bankable for the private sector. And this is very much we see as our role. From the technology perspective, IFC, I'd say, is agnostic to the various technologies at the moment. We do see some trends. You know, the fact that lithium ion is somewhat tried and tested with a low environmental footprint, so certainly relevant in the African context. But that's not to say that the other technologies listed here don't also have a place. In terms of the opportunities, I think the low-hanging fruit will be initially the shorter term duration discharge opportunities. So the ramp rate control, renewables firming, these are going to have less of an impact on the renewable energy project tariffs. So if you have a larger battery, clearly the tariffs go up. And then also just frequency modulation. Again, you know, very short-term discharge cycles. So again, relevant in the African context. Okay, next slide, please. So just a brief slide on the technology challenge that we see. So a lot of the R&D so far has gone into electric vehicles, you know, the discharge cycles up to 4 hours, and a broad challenge that we see for new technologies developing in the longer term is just to use longer duration, cheaper batteries in emerging markets. So we think this is needed for the peak shifting application in a number of markets. But again, that's not to say that the sort of the shorter term cycle batteries are not very relevant as well in various applications, various contexts here. We similarly think there are potentially more solar, so solar plus storage applications than wind initially, again, just because of the economics and the nature of the wind resource perhaps lends itself better to longer discharge cycles for the technology, although we hope to see investment opportunities in both wind and solar. And, you know, although lithium ion is well suited for developed markets, you know, the sort of easy to recycle, longer duration batteries are certainly going to be important. Next slide. So this just shows the economics for solar plus storage. So the graph shows now and then 10 years in the future, the levelized cost of energy for various firm technologies, so coal, gas, and solar plus storage. And you can see that from this slide that the solar and batteries are already very competitive with gas peakers in today's market. This is global data. And so over the next decade, we think that, you know, solar plus batteries is going to become even more compelling, and we're just really likely to see, you know, meaningful direct competition also with coal in the near future. So again, really very relevant when we think about the African context, the need for cheap and renewable firm power. Next slide, please. So yeah, just, I mean, to summarize, these are kind of the kind of key takeaways from my discussion. So, you know, we're entering into this period of really rapid and significant growth here on the continent. You know, projects for the near term, although likely to be lithium ion, other technologies are definitely going to be needed. You know, we continue to see cost improvements, but we'll likely see some price limits on certain technologies in the near future. Batteries, solar plus batteries is already competitive, as I just mentioned, and is going to be even more competitive over the coming decade. And batteries are just going to really play this highly integral role in renewables penetration. So, you know, even though the policy and the procurement models really need to be defined in various country contexts, it's very much, I think, an important time for us all to engage in this market. Just go to my final slide. So yeah, so you know, DFIs, I think we have an important role to play. You know, creating new markets, but then as does you know, the government clients, the developers, the EPC contractors, and the technology providers. So really, you know, everyone else on this call, I think, will have a very important role to play. So let me stop there. Back over to you, Bella, and thanks everyone for listening to me.
Thank you for that presentation. I think it summarized very well, you know, a very complex issue in a massive continent. So it's not easy. A few of the people were asking if we were talking about specific countries, and I'm like, no, we're talking generically, you know, a little bit about the continent. We understand this is difficult, you know, because not all the countries are the same, but nevertheless, important and valuable information. We can see, not perfect. Look, we can see it perfectly now. Make sure that you take the mute of your microphone, because otherwise we won't be able to hear you. Perfect. Off you go then. And keep sending the questions. Tom, take a look at the questions. There's a lot already. If you can answer any by text.
Yeah, I was trying to answer a few as we were going.
Yeah, I saw. I was as well. But for those people that have just arrived, just to let you know, we're recording the session and we will send it to you and the materials. So don't worry, they will be available. Go ahead, Luke.
Okay. Tom, thank you so much for all of that. Really great content. I think what I'm planning to share builds right on top of that. Tom shared how there are a lot of different ways batteries can be used, you know, providing different services, deferring transmission and infrastructure upgrades, providing ancillary services, doing energy shifting. And one of the challenges that we have grown to address over the years as a technology provider, Wärtsilä, is how do we combine and stack all of these things? Because a lot of our customers, when they buy a battery, they don't want it doing just one thing. And it shouldn't do just one thing, because it's perfectly capable of doing multiple things. In the context of a big grid, whether that's an entire, most of an African nation or some other larger type of interconnected area, having a battery that's dedicated to frequency response or doing a very specific peak shaving application can make a lot of sense, because you'll end up with multiple batteries providing different services throughout your grid. But a lot of the context that we are working in today is smaller grids. You could call them microgrids, but a lot of them are tens of megawatts, whether it's a mine or some industrial facility, where the battery is a singular entity that has to do a lot of different services at once. And so that's part of what we'll be diving into here. So diving right in, that's me. My background is in solar and forecasting, and how do we actually apply those technologies for the dispatch of batteries. Here at Wärtsilä, we have a software product called GEMS, which a lot of the screenshots and the way of working that we're going to be talking through are done inside of our software platform. So I just want to describe that briefly as an integrated software platform that provides different services. You can see EMS in the name. EMS is just an energy management system, but GEMS has grown to be more than that, intelligently operating large power plants and distributed resources, and even doing island control, where our power plant controller is the grid control software monitoring frequency and voltage. Just briefly for some of the architecture that on the technology side we use. It's very common for multiple different types of power plants, whether it's a standalone battery or a battery that's tied to renewables, or some type of hybridized thermal plant where you've got renewables and a battery, or any combination of those coming in at that main power plant bus co-located. That all of those different combinations of assets can be controlled by local power plant controllers, whether those are the Wärtsilä GEMS power plant controller, or if it's some other type of existing power plant controller on your existing asset. On-site operators log into those types of systems for visualizing what's happening, for monitoring alarms and events, and watching the different trends. And then our platform has a seamless connection to the cloud, so that remote operations and service centers and analysts can view that data remotely. Here's a layout of a typical site where the power plant controller has to have communication established with all the different power plant controllers, all the different metering, the switch gears. Whenever we come to a project, there's often already power there. There are already diesel generators or HFO engines, some limited renewables in certain cases. And the question that is really facing the entire world, not just Africa, is how do I push my renewable energy content further? I have growing load. I have existing electrical issues on my grid. I have other aging infrastructure. What's the most economic way for me to take the next step forward? How do I push my renewable energy forward without causing more problems? And so that's really the place where we engage with each of our different projects, where we connect, we lay out all the different design, we figure out what the most economic solution is to address the critical issues, and add the required infrastructure, IT, networking and communication, so that we can control the right assets. And our power plant controller provides all of the different key functionality that's required for optimizing those assets. Oftentimes when people size renewables or size battery systems, they're doing it in a simulation platform that's, you know, a third-party system off the shelf, and it makes a lot of assumptions, whether that's perfect forecasts in the dispatch logic, or whether that's some type of fully integrated control, when in real life you might have people who are the ones who are turning on and off the engines, and they might not always follow the schedule perfectly. And so handling the different forecast errors and human errors becomes something that the power plant controller has to do in a way that integrates with the human workflow really well. So that's part of that integration. So I have 3 different case study projects that I want to talk through that really paint a picture of what we're doing. One of these projects is on the African continent. The other 2 are not. They've been arguably precursors to where this technology is heading. So this one that I'm talking about first is in a Caribbean location on the island of Bonaire, where there's an existing wind farm and existing engines. And after adding a battery energy storage system and the GEMS automated plant controller, they were able to safely allow more renewables into the grid. There was significant curtailment beforehand due to limited spinning reserve capability. So they didn't have enough frequency response spinning reserves online so that when the wind would die, there would be load shedding events and things like that. And so instead, they were just curtailing the wind for some time while they were working on this next upgrade. They had some aging infrastructure. An old lead acid battery had been there beforehand that was at the end of its life. And so they were in this transition where when we added our system, we were able to decrease the fuel consumption by running the engines on higher loading, release the renewables, uncurtail them to let them into the grid. And all of this is done in the context of dispatch optimization. So really solving that problem and optimizing with artificial intelligence and a forecasted view of what's coming, whether we can turn on or off an engine based on what's going on. I'll just note this is a fairly small battery for the grid, and that's very typical. We see this in a lot of the tenders in Africa where the battery is small relative to the load. And so here, this is an island that has peak loads around 15 to 18 megawatts, depending on the season. And the battery is only a 6 megawatt battery. But because of the distributed nature of the load feeders and how the power generation is also modular with multiple different sizes of points of failure, that the biggest thing that is ever expected to trip offline is smaller under this 6 megawatt size. So that enables us to operate the grid very safely with a small battery relative to the load. Another project is a project in the Azores, and this one was started in 2018. So this is now a 2-year-old project for us that's been in operation. And this island is a bit more unique than the island of Bonaire in that it's capable of running the grid 100% on renewables. The previous project required there to always be 2 engines running at all times for security of supply in terms of short circuit current provision and enabling a safe grid. Whereas the battery on this island is very large compared to the load. It's a 6 megawatt battery on a 2 megawatt grid. And that's really for harnessing extra renewables when there's excess generation, as well as for providing sufficient short circuit current to clear faults on the grid. And there's a lot of different technologies and ways to do the protection scheme on the electrical side of the distribution network. So you don't need quite so big a battery potentially in your situation. But here we can run this island for multiple days without turning an engine on and seamlessly transition back and forth between having the engines running or having the engines completely off. And here we're doing a full dispatch optimization in the same way as Bonaire. I have some slides coming up that include a couple screenshots from this project, so there'll be some more details later. And then the third project that was recently announced and made public is in Mali at a mine that has typically around 40 megawatts of load and 30 megawatts of solar being integrated here. And so it's a very high renewable penetration. This grid will have very high renewable penetration for this type of location and this type of application. It's very heavy power requirements, big equipment that's getting turned on and off periodically and running with traditionally just engine generators, HFO fuel powered plant here. And so by adding the battery and the solar, we're effectively offsetting a bunch of fuel that would need to be procured otherwise. And so this is has a very short payback period, and the optimized control is integrated with the existing engine controls that are there as we progress towards hybridizing more and more of these thermal plants that are already in existence. This is a slide just briefly to show the battery enclosures that get deployed at these sites. So this is a containerized solution that's fully integrated and standardized. So this really reduces risk for projects where any of that integration might be happening, might be thought about happening on site. Instead, everything's pre-integrated and tested in the factory ahead of time so that all of the different pieces that need to work seamlessly together for safety of the system and long-term reliability are all ready to go and ship in a standard 40-foot container so that shipping costs are minimized to anywhere in the world. So this is a very cost-effective approach for these 5 megawatt and up type of systems. Here's just a couple screenshots. As I mentioned earlier, it's very important as we hybridize these different existing plants to engage with the way that operators and people need to look into what's happening in the artificial intelligence optimization engine. A lot of very common complaints that people have is that the automated logic or the artificial intelligence is too much like a black box. People don't know what's going on inside, and how do you tell when something's going wrong? How do you tell when something needs to be done by a human, when some action needs to be taken? And so we have very rich UI features, including single line diagram layouts, as well as in the bottom right, a forecasted view of not only which engines will be on at what times, but also where the battery state of charge is projected to go. And so this type of view provides visibility into the fact that, oh, the battery is going to be discharging over the next few hours, which you can see right there as we do some peak shaving effectively to not have to start a third engine, just as an example. And all of that logic that Tom mentioned, whether it's frequency response or spinning reserves or peak shaving, is all wrapped up and accounted for in the optimization logic. So just briefly, I'm going to go through a few screenshots fairly quickly. This is just an example of a load forecast in one of those projects. If there's a repeatable pattern to the load, models can be trained and to be adapting in real time using machine learning to forecast where that load is going to go. So that if the load is increasing and the renewables are coming down, then we don't turn off an engine, that we keep an engine running and even plan to turn on another one. Renewable forecasts also need to be integrated, because if that load is increasing and renewables are also expected to increase, then something different could be done with the battery. Instead, you could optimize what the battery is doing to avoid another engine start, to plan to use those renewables that are expected to come. This view is a 1 hour view from the island of Graciosa. We're very proud of this project. The owner of this project is very proud of it. Hence, we're able to sort of share some of this data publicly. The black is the load curve. This is just a 1 hour view. Yellow is solar, blue is wind, green is the battery. You can see the battery is doing a lot of stuff here. Brown on the far right is the engine. This battery is configured in grid forming mode, so it's providing virtual synchronous generation. It's responding to frequency deviations in real time. As the wind effectively collapses here, there's a sudden lull in the wind. The wind basically goes to zero a couple of times around 7 a.m. The wind forecast eventually gets updated with this new normal. The battery state of charge is being depleted. There's a lot of discharging happening here. And so that's also, that state is being updated and passed to the optimization engine. And then eventually the logic says, okay, now is the time we need an engine running, if not immediately, because maybe the state of charge is still relatively high. Maybe it's sufficient that you could technically last for even a whole nother hour or two, no problem. But in the spirit of optimizing what's really happening and not depleting that battery unnecessarily, the logic looks at all the constraints and operational parameters and says, okay, we need an engine on now, and it makes that recommendation. And then human operators go and confirm that action and ensure that that engine starts up and gets running. So during this whole hour, you can see there's a lot of volatility. The wind is up and down, and then there's even a transition from 100% renewables to hybrid here at around 720. During this whole time, because of the battery performing all of this activity, the grid frequency is dead flat the whole time. There's very close monitoring of frequency on the grid, and the battery inverter is performing a lot of that work to correct the engine, the volatility that's occurring in frequency, and reactive power is also accounted for as well. The battery is capable of outputting VARs. And so there's standard industrial control loops running at multiple levels in the inverter, in the power plant controller, at the grid controller level, monitoring frequency and voltage and ensuring that everything stays stable. So I'm running short on time, so just briefly wrapping up here. We looked at that chart briefly on the previous page. Here's a screenshot of the upcoming Fekola project, where we're doing that economic dispatch in the context of a big mine that's running at tens of megawatts with large solar. And so again, with that solar forecast integrated and with the load forecast, the optimization logic shuts off several of those engines in the morning as the sun is ramping up and turns them back on. It's planning to turn them back on in the future here on the right as time goes on. And one of my favorite charts is on the next page. We're solving, this economic dispatch problem in conjunction with the unit commitment problem, the same thing that ISOs do globally. Any type of system operator does this, but this is effectively a system operator in a box. So just as my last slide here showing, the last chart is the curtailment set point on the renewables. And you can see how it moves around based on the fact that this battery at the mine is only a 17 megawatt battery. And so in the event that the solar suddenly has a big burst of energy, or in the event that part of the battery suddenly becomes unavailable, you always want to keep your curtailment in check. You don't want your system to run out of control and have those renewables actually causing problems. And so there's a lot of checks and balances and monitoring that's happening inside the system to keep set points, not only on those the thermal plants in check, but the set points on the renewables as well. That wraps that up. It's a lot of content and it was pretty technical. So I apologize if you're in the non-technical crowd. I hope that was interesting. And I think we're ready for Q&A.
I think we're good. I'm non-technical stuff and I really enjoyed it. So thank you very much. It gave me an understanding of how the systems actually work. So you guys, we have a ton of questions. I'm not even joking. I mean, there are 36 waiting here. So we're not going to be able to get through all of them, but we're going to do our best. There's some here that I've already noted down to ask you. So let me start with one, and I'm going to throw it out there, and the two of you can unmute your microphones now. Let's talk freely, and add things and whatever. So okay, so do you see the capacity lifetime of the storage equipment as a challenge? It is generally 10 years and the PPAs are 20 years. So it's talking about life cycle here, Maxime. So
yeah. So Tom, I can take this first, and maybe you've seen some stuff from your side too, but yes, it is a challenge. I would say we've overcome it from a technology provider perspective. It is something we continue to revisit as we validate new vendors, as new technologies continue to emerge. But effectively, it can be supported through a long-term agreement, a guaranteed asset performance agreement, where the energy capacity is guaranteed, and we would simply augment, we would add additional capacity, whether that's in tranches at different years throughout those 20 years, or if it's a full replacement at some point near year 10 or 15 or something. There's a lot of different ways that gets handled by our proposals team, depending on the customer situation.
Tom?
Perhaps I can just add, I mean, I think from our side, it's just important when we're working with our government counterparts that the incentive structures are there for the augmentation of the batteries periodically. So it might be after 7 years or 10 years. We're starting to look quite closely at what sort of performance requirements there are in these PPAs. We obviously don't want them to be overly onerous, given it is quite a new technology, and we want the projects to remain bankable. So there's definitely a balance here to make sure that the private sector is incentivized to do those upgrades to the batteries throughout the project life cycle, but also that it's, as I say, not overly onerous, such that it might turn off a lender in a particular transaction.
Okay, don't worry, guys. I have so many more questions for you. So thank you for answering this first one. There is a lot of questions about technology, so I'm going to bundle those up so that we can, because I think we have been asked about every single technology. How about this? How about that? But the first one, it comes from Michael Geyer, who has been working on solar and renewables for a very long time, and says, would molten salt storage system like the ones in South Africa, CSP plants, but heated with PV electricity, be eligible for funding under the 1 billion battery program? This is more for you, I think, Tom. It's talking about the energy storage partnership, I think.
Referring to the World Bank's program. It's a very good question, and I do not know the answer to that, I'm afraid. So perhaps get in touch with ATA afterwards, and they can send that query through to us, and we put you in touch with the folks at the World Bank.
I think there is a degree of being technology agnostic in there, but mainly the battery and energy storage is still battery very, very largely. So, it's one of these things. Okay. So the feasible renewable energy penetration percentage for system design with a storage of 4 hours backup without any support from diesel generator. Is it feasible, I suppose, a renewable energy penetration percentage for system design with a storage for 4 hours backup without any support of diesel generation?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'll take that question. I think it's pretty related to what I was sharing. It's important to, when we talk about 100% renewable capable, it just means that the grid can run without any thermal plants running for 1 minute. I mean, it doesn't, time is not really the important part when you're talking about power. It's instantaneous. And if it's capable of running at 100% because of all the different grid safety things like short circuit current requirements and things like that, as long as those renewables keep running and as long as the battery spinning reserve duration, I mean, it could be a 15 or 30-minute battery, as long as your thermal plants can start up that fast. As long as that you can get the backup generation running quickly enough. And you don't need something that's 4 hours to qualify for some certain percentage of renewable energy. The batteries are not a generator. It's a thing that balances the grid. And so any type of analysis you do in a third-party tool to target some type of renewable fraction over a year, like let's say you want to hit 50% renewables for a whole year, then that process of simulating and determining how much wind and how much solar do you need to get there is what will determine that side of things. But that has nothing to, whether you're 50% of your total generation in terms of energy comes from renewables or not. You might be a 100% renewable capable grid, you might not be, but that's a different metric. So make sure you keep power and energy separate when you're thinking about those renewable fractions.
How interesting. What are the benefits of having a PV with energy storage or battery energy storage hybrid at a single site versus having a standalone PV and a standalone battery energy storage to balance the whole grid? To me, this is an excellent question. So I'll leave it up to you guys to give the fine detail as engineers.
I've got a view on that. I mean, certainly we see often you know, in the African context, one of the sort of constraints, particularly if it's a tender, is access to land. So if we are doing a storage or a solar PV project, you know, just the nature of the government's ability to acquire the land rights as, you know, prior to the tender. I think that is quite just a simple, straightforward reason for co-locating. But look, I mean, from the technical perspective, Mike, let me hand over to you. I think there are obviously times when it probably makes sense for them not to be co-located.
Yeah, I think if there are existing issues in a grid on your distribution side, and you need some battery capacity out somewhere, and there's not a lot of land, you can't put a big solar farm, but there is a small portion of land near the substation where you can put a battery, but you still want the renewables, and those, because of the land rights issue, has to be somewhere else, then you separate them. But exactly like Tom said, most often when you're getting your land, it's pretty easy to co-locate them, especially if the battery is expected to mostly support and deal with the renewable energy electrical volatility. So that's really, I think, part of what you need to think through if you're trying to decide, like, why should I co-locate? Why should I put differently? From a technology perspective, it doesn't matter. You run your, you know, fiber optic connection wherever it needs to go, or you put a 4G modem so you can get that in real-time generation data relayed back to the controller, and go from there.
So just to clarify, like from the balance of system part, there is no gains to co-locating them. Like,
there are gains in terms of simplifying the system. You don't have to pay for a big transmission line if they're together. You don't have to account for the losses you will have transmission losses if it's a big distance. So there's definitely gains to co-locating, and especially the land rights thing. If you have a plot of land where you want to put both of these things, you go through that process once. Whereas if you have two sites, now you have to go through it with two different landowners, and it just adds more risk and potentially more time to your development of your project to have more locations. So there's benefits for sure to having it co-located.
Yeah, in my mind, it's a matter of roles as well, right? Does the grid operator / whatever entity, you know, leads says you have to provide dispatchable energy, or do they take it and then dispatch it themselves? It's like there's a matter of roles. For example, you in the Spanish grid, you can't store. There isn't like a legal storer, you know, like that figure doesn't exist. So therefore, there is no payment for it. I don't know. There is a number of things that are complicated to manage there. Okay, so you guys, COVID. How did you see the post-COVID financing of battery storage systems projects in Africa? Has anything changed?
Certainly from the financing side, clearly, I mean, there's impact on existing projects. You know, projects in the pipeline, you know, there's a number of ways these are currently being impacted. You know, you get, understandably, you're seeing developers or sponsors, in some cases, issuing, you know, force majeure notices. You know, it's difficult for them to get to site. So we're seeing that sort of thing happening. And also, I think just in terms of the actual, I mean, let me not speak for my financing colleagues at IFC, but you know, we do see that there are liquidity issues. You know, lenders will likely be looking at projects a little bit differently at the moment. But I think that's not to say that we're still not very busy preparing projects now, that we think, you know, as transaction advisory, preparing tenders that could go to market later in the year or next year. So, you know, we're still sort of very much gearing up for the recovery, and actually in some instances that we're actually running projects live now, live tenders now for bidders to begin to get access to data rooms virtually. We're looking at ways to to do virtual site visits and virtual bidders conferences. So there's a number of things that we're doing to mitigate. And I think one of the wonderful things in the silver lining in all of this is that, you know, it's really forcing us to work better with our clients online and virtually, which means less flights for everybody too. So there is a silver lining there.
The children are the big winners.
The children are the winners.
Okay, one here that I think is more for Luke. Is there a view on which type of lithium-ion battery chemistry is more suitable for the African continent? I understand that this is very, very technical, specific, and it might not. I don't know. I just putting it out there and see.
That's fine. I don't think so. There's only a few vendors that are really able to provide 5 megawatt and up type of systems, so large utility scale lithium ion systems, and those chemistries are LFP or NMC. Those are really the only two that are really there's LTO also, so that technology is not as widely available as NMC and LFP. So in the context of how much the grid energy storage world is riding on the coattails of the EV and consumer electronics industries in terms of battery development, really it's those main technologies of NMC and LFP that are getting used in EVs and consumer electronics that are simply most widely available, that have operations and maintenance support networks, that if you do have some modules that go bad, that it's easy to get replacement parts quickly and replace those modules and things like that. So it's really that network and commercialization aspect that's really important.
Thank you very much, Luke. Since we don't have a lot of time, there are like 3 questions I want to ask. There is a ton more. We have like 50 open, but can't get through all of them, sadly. So I just want to bundle them up, and then you guys can choose, or, you know, or maybe reply them all, you know, see how you can manage that. One is about business models. Someone here is saying, hey, why not energy storage as a service, you know, which is something very Silicon Valley these days that, you know, that goes far, but I don't know whether it fits in the African context. Another of the questions is one that I bundled up already. Some people ask, how about compressed air? How about redox flow batteries? How about thermal storage CSP? How about hydrogen? You know, there's been a lot of questions like this. And then tied to that one, there is someone here that is saying, hey, a lot of African countries are investing in gas production infrastructures right now, such as Nigeria, Mozambique, Tanzania. How do you see the energy policies in those countries regarding energy storage solutions based on batteries, taking into account the gas generators can also provide similar ancillary services as the batteries? And do you believe that really, truly batteries can be competitive in these countries, in this context? So I understand there is like a big mix mash, but they kind of fit together in some ways. So I just leave this with you, and look, you're ready to go. So
Sure.
why don't you go first, and then Tom
can
unless
answer. You really want to jump in on this one.
Go ahead, Lou.
All the different technologies that are out there, they all have their niche. I think there's always an application. There's different businesses pushing different technologies. Really what we've seen working at scale though over the last couple of years is lithium ion being the most cost effective. When you look at dollars per kilowatt hour installed, full life cycle maintenance, including reliability and guarantees to last a certain significant amount of time, like at least 10 years, lithium ion is the only one that really fits all of those criteria and is the most economically viable. And so that's why we see the conversation centering around that. And that's why we see most of the big projects globally are those technologies. Does it mean that any of those other options aren't viable? No, but especially if there is an existing reason to pursue some other technology like thermal, that you have a big source of heat for some reason, you have a big CSP plant, then those thermal storage technologies can make a lot of sense. Yeah, and then I think going to that that
I can
second
remind
question,
you, yeah. So there was one about the the one that you've already done is in business models, then there is technologies, and the third one was in the gas pipelines. When countries are investing in gas pipelines, what sense does it make, to actually go for storage or batteries when you're already investing in the infrastructure?
I can take the gas related one. I mean, I think even with gas projects, there's clearly a business case. We see it in the UK. We see it in more developed markets where batteries are still required for deferral of the upgrades that I mentioned earlier. So things like very short-term frequency response. It's proving to be very cost effective. But I think just from a sort of policy position in general, and there needs to be a balance between creating incentives that are affordable for the grid, affordable for the countries, but also giving the lenders some certainty on cash flows. So when we see in the African context, for instance, capacity payment charges, these are going to be attractive to lenders. Energy take or pay commitments are going to be attractive to lenders. But understandably, the utilities are quite cautious that they don't necessarily have a sense of how much they're going to rely on that battery. They may not have had the exposure to the benefits of these projects yet in that context. So, I think knowledge sharing is really key here from the whole industry, just to see, as Luke's been showing us, the benefits of these projects in other markets, so we can all start to understand them, and at the same time, make sure that the projects aren't these high-risk projects that are just for the equity guys, but actually there's a payment mechanism such that the cash flows aren't so volatile, so we can again get debt financing into these structures.
There is definitely something there with gas and like stranded assets, right? And how many financial institutions are ready to put their money as time goes by more and more. So I suppose that also can affect not so much the short term, but certainly the long-term financeability of those assets.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen a lot of gas usage growth in the US, as Tom mentioned, globally. It's a great replacement for coal. Renewables are also growing still globally. You need some type of fuel infrastructure, whether that's natural gas today or in the future, if it's other types of fuels derived from renewables too. 20, 30 years from now, when we have a lot of excess renewable generation, those could be potentially generating synthetic fuels, and you can still use some of that infrastructure even for that type of situation. So, I think that it's a good way to go towards that type of infrastructure.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Luke, and thank you very much, Tom, for sharing your expertise with us today. And thank you very much, everyone in the audience. I did want to read one of the comments here from David Ross that's saying energy storage as a service is already being piloted in Rwanda by projects developed by the Carnegie Mellon University in Africa. I think that's excellent that we're seeing, a little bit of movement with piloting this type of things. And we've learned a lot today about, the bright future of energy storage. So thank you very much for being here, and we'll see you in the next one. Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.